So far, we've looked at the global environmental issues from a fairly technical point of view. We've used the IPAT framework to explore the components that contribute to our environmental impact. We've looked at the factors affecting global population growth, and we have learned that we actually don't know much about how to curb consumption, which is having a big effect on the planet. We also discussed the role that technology might play and how it might affect how we interact with the environment in the future. During this entire discussion, we looked at our environmental challenges in a fairly detached way. We sort of looked at it from the outside, like one studying the development of another planet. What's been missing so far is some sort of reflection on the fundamental reasons how humans ended up here. In this lecture, we are going to explore some of that further. In the previous lecture on how many people the world can sustain, we made an important observation. When discussing the concept of carrying capacity, we recognize the point that once humans have covered their basic needs, then we have a choice about what standard of living we want to live, and in fact, how much we want to consume. So the environmental challenges that we're facing today didn't just happen to us. These challenges are the result of a series of choices that humans have made in societies and as individuals. The goal of this lecture is to look at some of the fundamental beliefs and how they have shaped how humans and how we as individuals view the environment, and how that affects how we interact with the environment. So this takes us into the topic of environmental philosophy and environmental ethics. The goal of this lecture is to give you a brief introduction to the overall topic. We will start by explaining how worldviews shape human actions. I will then introduce the concept of instrumental and intrinsic values. And we use these to explore 4 ecological philosophy perspectives, and they have their roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. After that, I will introduce aspects of the indigenous perspective to highlight that one can look at the world very differently. The main purpose of this lecture is to highlight the role of environmental ethics and what role they can play in helping us reflect on our environmental challenges and to help find meaningful solutions for the future. It's necessary to realize that how we look at the world and how we interact with the world are both heavily influenced by our own personal beliefs. These are beliefs that are the results of all the influence that we've experienced in our lives. These include how we were brought up, the perspectives of our friends we spend time with, the books we read, but also the bigger cultural contexts that we are exposed to throughout our lives. And so all of these influences together determine how we look at the world, how we interpret information about the world, and ultimately how we as individuals interact with that world. Now, this is different for everybody because we've all been influenced by different events and experiences throughout our lives. The chart on this slide shows the results of a study that looked at the trust that people have in scientists as a reliable source of information about environmental issues. The study was conducted in the United States, and the chart shows how trust differs among the members of different political parties. You can see that trust is highest among Democrats at the top level and lowest among Tea Party members, which was a conservative movement within the Republican Party at the time this study was done. The point is that science that environmental researchers produce is the same for everybody. The science that comes out is accessible to everybody, and everybody is presented with the same facts and data. But the worldviews of the recipients of that information that determines whether they trust the information and what they will do with it, that's dependent on the values and ethics and morals of the people receiving it. Okay, that's kind of a long introduction, but let's start with some definitions now as we get into this subject matter. Let's talk about philosophy. So we're going to use the definition of philosophy, that is, philosophy is the study of general fundamental problems concerning matters such as existence, knowledge, values, reason, the mind, and language. So environmental philosophy is a branch of philosophy that is concerned with the natural environment and the place of humans in that natural environment. In other words, environmental philosophy examines how we look at the physical world and how we conceptualize the idea of the environment and our effect on it and influence and our role in it. Typical questions that environmental philosophy concerns itself with include, what do we mean when we talk about nature? Or what is the value of natural non-human environments? And how is it of value to us as humans? And how is it just valued unto itself intrinsically? Other sorts of questions include, how should we respond to environmental challenges, such as environmental degradation, pollution, and climate change? And things like, how can we best understand the relationship between the natural world and human development? In comparison to philosophy, ethics is concerned with the moral principles that govern a person's or a group's behavior. And more specifically, environmental ethics studies the moral aspects of our relationship with the environment. So ethics aims to give us some guidance about what is wrong or what is right in terms of our behavior and actions. It tries to answer the question on how should we live with the environment. In the reading that there is for this topic, Bordeaux asks, what obligations do humans have towards the environment, and what types of policies and institutions are needed to fulfill these obligations? Now, ethical considerations are included in every question and decision we make regarding our interaction with the environment. Here are some examples that come to mind. Should humans continue to clear-cut forests just for the sake of human consumption? Should humans continue to make gasoline-powered engines? Is it okay ethically to fly to Hawaii for a Christmas holiday? Is it okay to pay only $10 for a t-shirt, given that it's made in China and all the social and environmental costs associated with that we know about? Some of these questions, like the first two, are fundamental and big picture questions that need to be answered by our society as a whole. However, the third and fourth questions are very practical and examples of ethical questions that we as individuals are confronted with every day. The common theme for answering all these questions is the consideration of whose interests must be considered and how do we account for those interests. Are we just thinking about ourselves, or are we thinking about other people and how they'll be affected by our choices as well? Are we considering the effect of our choice on the environment? Are we thinking about future generations and how they are affected by our choices today? The answers to these questions are value judgments. And this is a key point. Because they're value judgments, there is no obvious right or wrong answer. They are values that a person holds. In addition, all of these questions involve challenging trade-offs among objectives. Does my personal benefit from flying to Europe to see my family for Christmas outweigh the long-term consequences of the carbon emissions of that flight? That's a question someone might have to ask if they were going to go back to Europe and see their family. It's extremely difficult to make this comparison, and the outcome depends heavily on your objective. The person's parents in Europe, they might think it's worth it to have their child come back and visit them over the Christmas holidays. A Pacific Islander who is threatened by sea level rise because of global climate change, because of all the air traffic, might think that it's unacceptable for this person to fly to Europe just to visit their parents. Why is thinking about these questions necessary? Because it relates to the fundamental core of why we ended up with the environmental challenges we are facing today. And reflecting critically on our ethical perspectives and the choices we make is necessary for finding meaningful solutions for those challenges. I hope some of these explanations have convinced you that thinking about environmental ethics is necessary both for understanding how we ended up here and, importantly, for deciding how we make the next move in order to get to a more sustainable future. In this brief overview, I will primarily focus on Western perspectives because they currently dominate the worldview of the most influential societies that have brought us to where we are today in terms of global environmental challenges. Towards the end of this lecture, I will talk about indigenous perspectives to highlight that there are other ways of looking at the world and that these different views and values can lead to a completely different interaction with the environment. Some of the main authorities that have provided Western cultures with ethical guidelines for our interactions with the environment have been religion, philosophers, and science. Each of these authorities, because they're authorities in different realms, then they bring different perspectives. And all of these together have really molded and formed the kind of Western perspectives that we see today in terms of how we relate to the environment. So let's look at some of these in more detail. Whether we should protect nature for human sake or just for nature itself, for its intrinsic value. And this relates to how we value nature. And traditionally, there are two contrasting perspectives on this. Instrumental value, also known as use value, refers to the value an object has as a means to an end for another purpose. For example, from a student's perspective, teachers have instrumental value for the students because the teachers provide knowledge. Or from the perspective of an animal, a fruit has instrumental value for that animal because the animal feeds on that fruit. In contrast to instrumental value, we have intrinsic value, which is also known as existence value. Intrinsic value refers to the value of an object has in itself or for its own sake. It's very normal for us to think that a person has value regardless of what they do or how they contribute to society. Human life simply has value on its own. It has intrinsic value. I hope that you would value anyone you meet as a person, even if you don't know what they do or where they're from or anything about them. We have intrinsic value for each other as human beings. However, this perspective about valuing things for their intrinsic value becomes less clear when we talk about, for instance, fruit. So does a fruit have intrinsic value regardless of whether or not it feeds animals or you or not? So it's quite easy to see the argument previously about instrumental value that the fruit provides you for nutrients, but does fruit have intrinsic value regardless of whether it provides you any sort of nutrients or satisfaction or satiation at all? Now, different environmental philosophies have been organized on a spectrum from anthropocentric to ecocentric worldviews. So I'm sure most of you know that anthropocentric is a fancy way of saying human-centered, whereas ecocentric means nature-centered. People subscribing to human-centered environmental worldviews are interested in protecting the environment because of the environment's usefulness to us as humans and the role of ensuring the survival of our human species. Supporters of the ecocentric worldviews, on the other side, believe that the environment should be protective because nature just has an inherent right to exist and doesn't depend on any value that humans give it. Anthropocentric worldviews mainly focus on instrumental values, and some of them include the idea of intergenerational equality and equity. Intergenerational equity refers to the concept of fairness or justice among human generations. So off into the future of other generations, there still needs to be this concept of fairness or justice to future generations. You might remember the definition we talked about of sustainable development that we talked about before. And that definition is the following: that sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own need. So this definition stresses the need for intergenerational equity. Ecocentric worldviews, on the other hand, believe that nature had an inherent right to exist and therefore focuses on intrinsic values. So some of the ecocentric worldviews also believe in interspecies equity, which means that every species should have equal opportunities to pursue their own destiny, whatever that destiny is for that particular species. Let's go back to the worldview of Judeo-Christian tradition. The values and perspectives that we have discussed so far generally line up with the worldview that the environmental philosophers refer to as domination. So nature only exists to serve humans and therefore only has instrumental value. Nature is a simple store of resources for humans to use and a sink for waste products to be produced that are produced by humans to be deposited. So it's a source for all our resources and a sink for the waste of all our activities. And thirdly, that the extraction of environmental resources is just simply a technical issue. It's not should we log the forest, or it's not should we mine the ore. It's just how do we log, how do we mine so that we can take those resources to serve humanity, this idea of domination. When you look at humanity's interactions with the environment today, you can find lots of examples of this worldview. So along with the idea of logging and mining, it's the way we carelessly use fresh water, the way we overfish the oceans, how we simply dump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. All of these actions reflect a domination attitude where nature is viewed as having unlimited resources and unlimited sinks that we can use for our benefit. Now, there are some obvious challenges with this perspective. As we've been talking about, it only values nature for what nature provides to us. And this view does not consider the biological constraints of the planet. This view suggests that we should only protect what is of value to humans. If it's not of value to humans, we don't need to protect it under this domination view. So the domination worldview is all about instrumental values or use values. It should come as no surprise then that this idea of domination is on the very left of our spectrum of environmental philosophies. Let's go to the next environmental philosophy, and it is this idea of stewardship. And so this is an environmental philosophy which accepts that nature is complicated and that we live in a closed system where resources and ecosystem services are limited. The stewardship worldview also accepts that human species relies on this functioning ecosystem for our very survival. To ensure our survival, humans have a moral obligation to be stewards, protectors, or managers of nature. So we are moving away from the view of being the consumer and customer of nature and all that it has to give us. We're moving away from that view, which was epitomized by the domination worldview, and we're moving to where we're working as a steward or a manager of nature in this view of the stewardship worldview. So to embrace this stewardship worldview properly, it requires that humans have to develop a meaningful understanding of the environment so that we can know how to be stewards of the natural world. It is these ideas that provided the initial foundation for the field of resource and environmental management that this course is in. Of course, there are still challenges with this worldview. It is still strongly an anthropocentric view, and it views humans as the owners, or at least the tenants of the planet. And it suggests that there's a hierarchy among species and that we see ourselves at the top of the creation, and it's our role and our responsibility to look after everything else. So the stewardship worldview is still on the anthropogenic side of the spectrum of all the environmental philosophies, but you can see we've shifted a little bit to the right. The next environmental philosophy that we're going to introduce is the one of conservation. And this worldview believes that land, animals, and wilderness have intrinsic value all unto their own. In other words, there is a general appreciation for natural, wild, and free things. The conservation worldview also acknowledges that our disregard for the land is one of the fundamental reasons for the environmental challenges that humans are facing today. So to hold against this, we need to protect, preserve, and manage the natural environment. Two very prominent figures in the development of the conservation philosophy were John Muir and Aldo Leopold. John Muir was a Scottish-American naturalist, an environmental philosopher, and an early advocate of the preservation of wilderness in the United States. In 1892, he founded the Sierra Club, which is still a prominent environmental organization today, more than 100 years later. He also petitioned the United States Congress for the National Parks Bill that was passed in 1890, establishing Yosemite National Park. Due to his contribution to this national park movement in the United States, John Muir is commonly referred to as the father of national parks. Another prominent person in the development of the conservation movement in the United States was Aldo Leopold, and he's an American author, a philosopher, scientist, and conservationist. His worldview included holistic and ecocentric ideas, and he strongly emphasized the importance of biodiversity and ecology. He's also known as the father of wildlife management. This quote from Aldo Leopold clearly illustrates his perspective. And in one of his books, Sand County Almanac, it's quite a small book, and it's just packed with quotes like this that talk about nature and humans' relationship to nature. So in this quote, it's a quote, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise," end quote. Both Muir and Leopold lived at the turn of the 20th century, and their concern about the environment was a response to the Industrial Revolution that gave humans totally new control and new means to interact with the environment and essentially destroy the environment much more efficiently than humans had ever been able to do before. Another very key figure in the environmental movement in North America is Rachel Carson, who published the book Silent Spring back in 1962. Now, at this time, in the early 60s, there were increasing concerns about environmental issues, and many scholars started to talk about environmental ethics and what our role is in the environment. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist, and her book Silent Spring documented the effect that widespread use of pesticides was having on the environment. So the title of the book is referring to a spring without any birds, because the birds are becoming extinct as a result of extensive pesticide use. So the spring then would be silent without all the birds singing. Her book substantially raised the awareness around the environmental issues, and certainly in the American public, it inspired a grassroots movement. Her efforts and the public pressure from the environmental movement eventually resulted in the reversal of the national pesticide policy in the United States and led to the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. So huge influence based on her work and on particularly that book. While conservation is a step in the right direction, depending on your personal worldview, certainly on a step in the right direction towards a more sustainable future, even this view has challenges. There is still a separation between humans and nature. The focus is on preserving wilderness in national and provincial parks, while human development and the destruction of nature outside of these parks can go on. Conservation also does not account for the fact that the planet is in constant flux and everything is always changing. So just preserving everything, this idea of preservation, is not always the right way. Another challenge is that many, if not all, of the global environmental issues, such as climate change, ocean acidification, and global pollution, that these issues do not adhere to boundaries. So it's therefore impossible to protect parks from these influences of these environmental changes. Still, we're moving further over from the ecocentric end of the spectrum of environmental philosophies. So conservation, the conservation worldview, is the first philosophy that aims to protect nature simply because of the intrinsic value that nature has. The last environmental philosophy that we're going to talk about here is the idea of deep ecology. And this was originally introduced in the 1970s by a Norwegian philosopher, Arne Naes. This idea, this deep ecology, which is a great name, by the way, views humans as integral part of the Earth system. So the Earth system that we began talking about on the first few lectures, so this is the idea of the biosphere, and humans are an integral part of that rather than separate from it. The philosophy of deep ecology is deeply rooted in the belief that all living things have value on their own, independent of their usefulness to other living things. So it is on the very right of the ecocentric end of the spectrum, with a focus on intrinsic value and interspecies equity. This is also known as biospheric egalitarianism. So instead of satisfying humans' needs, deep ecology aspires to support the richness and diversity of all life forms. Humans can only interfere with nature to satisfy their vital needs under this worldview. This means that instead of having the functional and utilitarian relationship between humans and nature that most of the other philosophies promote, deep ecology views this relationship as deeply intertwined and promotes a deep environmental consciousness and spiritual connection with the environment. To implement this philosophy in our current world will require fundamental changes in the structure and the values across societies. The proponents of deep ecology believe, for example, that a different economic system must replace capitalism, and the commodification of nature and the concept of economic growth are the fundamental causes of environmental degradation. They also believe that we need to substantially reduce the world population in order to live more harmoniously with nature. Of course, there are challenges with this deep ecology worldview. Because it is so radical, the philosophy has been broadly criticized as being utopian. Some philosophers from developing nations have also criticized it as elitist, since giving nature more space and becoming one with nature requires a certain standard of living where one does not struggle with the basics of survival. This brings us to the end of our discussion of Western ecological philosophies that range from being completely anthropocentric to being completely ecocentric, with a few worldviews in between. What I want you to take away from this discussion are basically the descriptions of the various philosophies and their location along the spectrum. We've just looked at ecological philosophies that have emerged from Western cultures, primarily because they represent the roots of the dominant perspectives in our current world, and they are the main causes of the environmental challenges that we face today. Now, to highlight that one can look at the world very differently, I would like to contrast these Western perspectives with the indigenous perspective. We will not be going into detail here because I'm not qualified to talk about the indigenous perspective, and there's a lot more to it than we can cover in this lecture. However, it's important that you understand that one can look at the world very differently, and these differences have far-reaching consequences on how people think about the environment and interact with it. There are also courses within REM and in other departments that explore the indigenous perspectives in much greater detail. What you see on this slide is the Kareoka II Declaration, where indigenous people from the Americas, Asia, Africa, Australia, Europe, and the Pacific collectively expressed their serious concern about the way the world was exploiting natural resources on which indigenous people depend. The declaration was signed during the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, And this conference was a milestone in the development of international sustainability initiatives. And we'll talk more about the Earth Summit later on in the course. The declaration by Indigenous peoples here describes some of the fundamental values and principles of the human to nature interaction that many Indigenous cultures share. It states, quote, "Our lands and territories are at the core of our existence. We are the land and the land is us. We have a distinct spiritual and material relationship with our lands and territories, and they are inexorably linked to our survival and the preservation and further development of our knowledge systems and cultures, conservation, and sustainable use of biodiversity and ecosystem management." Now, you can clearly see that the foundation of the statement is fundamentally different from anything that we have discussed so far from the Western perspectives. One of the key aspects of the Indigenous perspective is what White and Kumo refer to as care ethics. The Indigenous interpretation of care emphasizes the importance of one's awareness of one's place in a web of different connections, spanning many different parties, including humans, non-human beings, entities, such as water bodies, and collectives, such as forests or seasonal cycles. It is also important to understand that these connections and interdependencies come with moral obligations and need to care for them. The term reciprocal responsibilities means that if I'm getting some benefit from a relationship, I have a moral obligation to care for that relationship, not just focus on getting the most of it for myself. Another aspect of the care ethic is to value skills and virtues, such as the wisdom of grandparents and elders, attentiveness to the environment, and Indigenous stewardship practices instead of material possessions. You might remember that this is very much in line with what Robert Cates is promoting in the reading called Population and Consumption that we had earlier. Of course, the care does not only relate to the environment, but also within Indigenous communities, where a lot of care is needed to restore people and communities who have been wounded from injustices and consequences of colonization. Finally, this deep-rooted care for each other, including care for the environment, is the foundation of the Indigenous battle for political autonomy and the right to serve as responsible stewards of their lands that their physical and cultural survival depend on. As I mentioned earlier, there is, of course, much more to the Indigenous perspective. One thing is that there isn't a single Indigenous perspective, but many perspectives that have their differences. The point here is simply to highlight that one can look at the environment and the role of humans within that environment differently, and that these differences can put societies on very different pathways with the environment. I think it's an interesting thought experiment, imagining how the world would look today if the worldviews of Indigenous and settler communities were reversed. Let's wrap up by briefly summarizing the main points of this lecture on environmental philosophy and ethics. I want you to understand that personal perceptions and beliefs influence how we see the world, how we make sense of the information that is available to us, and how we approach problems. The field of environmental ethics examines our worldviews regarding our interactions with the environment. Ethics considers values and aims to give moral guidance on what we should do. We have discussed the difference between instrumental and intrinsic values. And we looked at 4 different Western environmental philosophies, which we arranged on a spectrum from anthropocentric to ecocentric. We also introduced the Indigenous perspective briefly to illustrate how one can look at the world very differently. It's necessary to realize that the environmental philosophy and environmental ethics force us to deeply reflect on the root causes of our current environmental challenges. And with that, it helps us to start the societal changes that we need to solve these problems. So thank you for listening through this lecture, and we will talk to you again soon. Bye for now.